that is the major trunk line for a lot of our country's fiber.
Right.
And so you're really plugged into, well, on the old Larson Air Force Base, I'll put it to you this way. Back on the other side, Microsoft has a big complex back there, and that's where they back up data.
Well, like a bunker.
That's where I'm sure where part of the cloud's at. I mean, and it's kind of, again, going back to the days of the missile squadron.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, it you know, for some reason, it's all right there. And, you know, it's the old Sage building is what another company was doing, because that was the radar and early detection system. And those were really heavily built. They were designed to withstand quite a bit of overpressure in a nearby detonation. And somebody came up with the term, they called it Titan. And even though I don't think it was Barry. Why they didn't use the sites, I don't know. There was talk that, you know, he was going to do that. And I don't really know I know a buddy of mine he and his wife came out and stayed with me last year, who I hadn't talked to in years. We'd never met, but just always talked, much like you and I do, talk on the phone and discuss different things. And you know, he came out, and his wife was from Spokane, so, you know, there was a lot of discussion on Fairchild Air Force Base, and the museum there had part of the original collection for the first generation from what we call the National Aerospace Trust.
Uh-huh.
Now, Fred was a member of that, and I think their leader at the time was Lancelot Wright. We call him Lance Wright. Well, Lancelot and I were like oil and water. And Fred would kid me. He would say, "Gary, I can't get into this." You know, and he was, because Fred wanted to maintain neutrality, and I don't blame Fred.
That's right. Yeah.
You know. I'm sorry?
Well, yeah, I understand where it was coming from, but he's your buddy, and he's his buddy, so he's got to...
Well, that's it. And see, Lance had a true... Well, there's a little more to the story. I mean, you may have heard of a gentleman by the name of Todd Skinner. If you haven't, be sure and look it up. I mean, Todd was the one that was doing all the heavy work on the Wamego Atlas E site in Kansas.
Right,
okay.
Yes, yeah.
Well, if you remember the rest of the story, is, you know, he had the world's largest LSD lab there.
Yeah.
Well, Lance Wright and Fred were always there, right? And I remember one time Lance Wright made the comment, he says, "You know, if you only knew what goes on around here." And I often laugh at that. Right?
I'm glad you didn't.
You know, I mean, I'm sure Lance knew something was up. Whether or not he knew the whole story, I don't know. And there was another gentleman involved, and doggone it, right now I can't think of his name. He was a fixed wing and a helicopter pilot, and he would fly them all around. And the whole group would go around collecting a lot of the first generation stuff. Well, when the original museum, which used to just be a building on Fairchild Air Force Base outside of Spokane, it used to be just some train cars. And a bunch of that first generation collection was put together and given to the museum. Well, all of a sudden Siloworld was growing. I was becoming somebody.
Yeah.
Okay, I was doing lots of consulting on first generation, but not Titan 1. All of a sudden, I made certain people very, very jealous. I'll call a spade a spade. All of a sudden, I was denied. You can never look at any of those things in that first generation collection, because what I was after, as good as I think I am, okay, and I say that loosely, I mean, I can find blueprints at a drop of a hat for just about every first generation site. But Bryce, I can't find, and I hope your listeners really hear this, I can't find one Walker print for the sites around Roswell, New Mexico, and the sites that I owned, and I've worked on for 30 years. And it's very frustrating because just a few, right, would be very, very helpful, but the only thing I've come close to is a deactivation print that was done of Site 9 of the Walker Group when the sites were turned over for government auction. And the gentleman I saw it. I didn't get a copy of it, and I was supposed to get a copy. I'm just hoping at some point I still can. But in essence, it showed the layout. And what I mean by that is literally the surface plot plan that showed where everything was located on that particular site in reference to a datum point in the ground.
Top side?
Yes. Yeah. And, that's as close. And so, when I was denied this, Bill Huey, I'll be very upfront with you, Bill Huey heard about it. Well, Bill Huey's a retired missile combat crew commander. Spent his life in the U.S. Air Force. And Bill and I were friends. And even though I haven't talked to him, I still are. I hope he's doing well. And Bill was in Montgomery, which is at Maxwell Air Force Base, which is the U.S. Air Force Historical Research Center. Well, when Bill found out this, Bill gets a hold of the Inspector General of the United States Air Force. And all of a sudden, I guess Bill got it pushed through, and all of a sudden, Bill contacts me and he says, "Gary, you ought to feel very good about this, but from the highest echelons of the United States Air Force say that you are more than welcome to view anything that they have."
Of course.
And so I was always honored by that. And not that I ever did it, because what wound up happening is the collection then went to one of the Atlas E sites. Now, again, this is how this works synchronicity-wise. It's really quite fascinating. Jim Curry, who owned, remember that Titan 2 site, right? That's where his bunny slippers, before Gene bought that site from Jim, okay? Jim was a UPS pilot, okay? And so Jim was always flying all over the place, right? So we would always talk, and I'd give him the coordinates of the sites, and he'd plug them in and try to fly over them when he was doing his approach, like into Denver. He'd fly over the old bombing range, trying to see from that elevation if he could make out the old Titan 1 sites.
Nice.
Things like that. Well, Jim just happens to be up in Washington, and he goes to the Sprague Atlas E site, and that collection was at the far end of the old launcher underneath all these tarps. And so word had it was they were waiting until the new building was funded and built for the museum at Fairchild, and then that collection would be brought back. And so I can't wait to really find out. Because I want to see what they specifically have in details to the Walker sites.
Definitely.
Now, take that for what it's worth. When you talk, if Fred Epler was alive, Fred tells me the stories, and I know they have it, that one of the repositories for a lot of the first generation sites were microfilmed, microfished. And they were at the Omaha district of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And I had to go through the Freedom of Information Act. They wouldn't just let me ask the questions. Can you imagine? And I often laugh about that, God, do we have to go that far here? Okay. And so, of course, I had to do my letter in the correct format for a Freedom of Information Act. And I get a letter back, and I talk to the gal, and she says, "Yeah, we got it. We put them in storage."